Hello out there, all you historians, and welcome to my source analysis and evaluation tutorial. In this video today, I'll be showing you how to analyze and evaluate a historical source according to AVARA's version 9 of the national syllabus. So I've given away this slide a little bit, but why use the wire method? So the wire method is a paragraph structure that is used to meet the history skills requirements at the year 7 and 8 levels for source analysis and evaluation for the new syllabus. If you don't believe me, you can scan the QR code here that Aristotle is guarding for us quite carefully. So if you are a year 7 and 8 teacher or a year 7 or 8 student in Australia, this is going to be particularly handy for you. So this is what the wire structure looks like. So the W stands for who, the I stands for information, the R stands for reliability, and the E stands for evaluate. If you want a copy of this worksheet right here, you can go ahead and scan the QR code. I'll also put a link for the file in the description too. So let's go through each step of the why method. So the W is who, so who made the source, what was their expertise on the topic, so you have to research the author pretty carefully, and then how well positioned were they to record the event. So there's a bit of research involved in the who. Information is maybe the most valuable part of the structure, of course, because all our sources give us information. That's why we're analysing and evaluating them. For this step, you need to say when the source was made, what type of source it is, and then the explicit information that is in the source as well. R for reliability. So you need to have a statement on how reliable the source is and why, what bias exists in the source, and what is the purpose of the source. Why did the creator make it? And then the last step of wire is E for evaluate. So what is the source useful for? And then how useful is the source and why? So I'm going to go through 3 exemplars now on my wire source analysis and evaluations. The first one is going to be on the topic of ancient Egypt. So let's say I'm doing a source investigation on Ramses II, and I'm going to use the poem of Pentar, which goes through the Egyptians' perspective of the Battle of Kadesh. Also known as the Salier 3 papyrus. So this is what a wire paragraph structure looks like. So going through the who now. So the poem of Pentar is one of the official Egyptian records of the Battle of Kadesh. It was written by a scribe named Pentar and contains Ramses II's personal account of the battle. Ramses II was extremely well positioned to record the event as he led the Egyptian victory and was present during the whole Kadesh campaign. So I'm meeting all the requirements for the who section there. Now, the red, the information. The poem of Pentar was made sometime between 1274 BC, the Battle of Kadesh, and 1213 BC, the death of Ramses II. Some historians say that the poem was written 4 years after the Battle of Kadesh. The text is a primary source because it was made by Ramses II, who fought in the Battle of Kadesh. The text outlines the 4 corps of the Egyptian army, how the Egyptians organized their infantry and used their chariots. Most importantly, the text outlines how Ramses rode ahead of the army with the corps, held Kadesh, and then was surrounded by the Hittites. In the text, Ramses states that the rest of the Egyptian army arrived at Kadesh just in time to defeat the Hittites, and that Egypt was destined to win the battle because their gods favored Ramses. So a lot of explicit information to unpack from the papyrus there. Now, going through the reliability in green. While the text is an important account of the Battle of Kadesh, it is not reliable as it contains Ramses II's extremely biased perspective and states that Egypt won the battle, even though the army couldn't hold Kadesh, and the Hittites reclaimed it only weeks later. The purpose of the poem is to depict Ramses as the perfect Egyptian warrior king who sees what needs to be done and takes action without fear or hesitation. The language in the poem is also highly emotive for a literal historical account. For example, the poem states that Ramses II was literally braver than 100,000 men combined and only refers to the leader of the Hittites as the wretched one. To my evaluation now, the poem of Pentar is only a somewhat useful source for understanding the Battle of Kadesh. It is useful for understanding some of the events within the battle, but it is so heavily biased towards Ramses II. It is certainly worth comparing to the Hittite account of the battle discovered on a clay tablet in 1986. However, the account is extremely useful for understanding Ramses II's ego and why he is considered to be one of the most famous pharaohs. So all sources are useful for something, so we have to acknowledge that too. And you can see in my exemplar, you need to go and do a lot more research by yourself and go beyond the source that you're analysing and evaluating. My next exemplar is from the Deep Time History of Australia unit. I'm going to be imagining that I'm doing a source investigation on fire stick farming, and one of my sources for this source investigation is going to be Joseph Lycett's painting of fire stick farming. The reason I'm doing this source for an exemplar as well is to not only show you a really good unpack of reliability, but also the level of research you need to do yourself to fully understand your topic and then your selection of sources too. So the painting was created by Joseph Lycett between 1820 and 1822 and depicts First Nations people using fire stick farming to hunt kangaroos. Lycett was a convict who was transported to Australia in 1814 for forging banknotes, a crime he also committed after arriving in Australia. This accounts for his skill as an artist. As Lycett was a non-First Nations painter and only had been in Australia for a short time, he had limited knowledge of the practice he observed. As such, he was poorly positioned to understand the process of fire stick farming and was not very well positioned to record the practice. Going through my information now, Lycett was ordered with creating the painting in 1820 as punishment for forging banknotes. Art historian John McPhee states that Lycett convinced First Nations groups in New South Wales to observe their everyday practices, making his painting a primary source. The painting provides us with some insight into the practice of fire stick farming and that First Nations people use fire to hunt kangaroos. Lycett's work shows us the practice involved a group of skilled people carefully starting a fire in a deliberate location where kangaroo were known to gather. However, most of the information in the source is unreliable. So going through my reliability now. As a historical source, this painting is extremely unreliable. Firstly, First Nations people in 1820 regularly used fire for hunting and were experts. This means they would not stand uphill from a fire as seen in Lycett's work because fire travels extremely quickly up a slope. The kangaroos are also running in different directions, demonstrating Lycett's inability to fully understand the practice he was recording. Secondly, the individuals in the painting would not need to use weapons like the spear and the boomerang used by the men in the foreground of the painting, because the fire was the only weapon they needed. Thirdly, the painting is flawed because it only depicts men. Women were also leaders and participants in fire stick farming in New South Wales, and the adults brought children with them so they could learn the practice for themselves too. Lycett's painting fails to depict any women or children. Lastly, the vegetation in the painting looks more English than the actual vegetation that existed and still exists in New South Wales. Lycett's work certainly contains some bias. He was ordered to complete paintings like this as punishment for forging banknotes and was part of an imperial colony that believed in Darwinism. So my evaluation. Lycett's painting is only useful for demonstrating how narrow the British perspective was a few decades after colonisation began when observing a complex First Nations practice like using fire for hunting. The painting is not very useful for understanding the practice of fire stick farming due to Lycett's limited understanding of the practice, his inherent bias, and his purpose for creating the artwork. So you can see the level of research you need to engage with yourself on your topic to fully analyse and evaluate sources that you're going to be choosing in your source investigation. My last exemplar now is from Japan under the Shoguns. It's a secondary source on Oda Nobunaga, and I'll read the source very quickly for you now. So the boy Nobunaga was a great fighter and was shrewd besides. He did not like the way the country was governed, and although his father himself was a priest, the son disliked the convents and looked with disfavour on the power and wealth which they had acquired. He enlisted as a warrior when but a boy, and was so brave and skillful in war that he was still young when he had taken a province and made himself daimyo or lord. So let's go through my last exemplar for you on a source analysis and evaluation of Oda Nobunaga. So this extract is from a book named The Story of Japan by Robert Van Bergen. The author was one of the first Americans to live in Japan after the nation decided to end its isolation from the outside world in 1853. Robert Van Bergen taught the Japanese daimyo English, and in turn they taught him Japanese history. The Story of Japan was the first book of Japanese history to be published in English. As Van Bergen's book was published hundreds of years after Nobunaga died, he was not really well positioned to record the life of Nobunaga and had to rely on the knowledge he gained when living in Tokyo for 40 years. Going through my information now. The Story of Japan was written in 1897, which was only a few decades after the Tokugawa shogunate ended. The book is a secondary source because it was published 315 years after Nobunaga died. Van Bergen would have had to rely on a range of sources and accounts on Nobunaga's life that he had access to. From Van Bergen, we learn that Nobunaga's father was a priest, he didn't like the way Japan was governed or that his family was wealthy, and that he was a skilled warrior from a young age. This extract on Van Bergen's chapter on Nobunaga is somewhat reliable. The author did not name his sources, bringing this account of Nobunaga into question. Secondly, Van Bergen lived in Japan during the Tokugawa shogunate and through the Meiji Restoration. This means he could have been subjected to biases. Additionally, Van Bergen was an American who lived in Japan hundreds of years after Nobunaga died. These facts reduce the reliability of his account compared to other sources. However, the information on Nobunaga corroborates with information in Dr. Stephen Turnbull's book Samurai Warfare, and most sources on Nobunaga agree that he was a skilled warrior from a young age, making this information trustworthy. So I'm talking about corroboration now to boost the trustworthiness of my source. The purpose of Van Bergen's book was to educate Americans on the history of Japan's three great unifiers and be the first account of Japanese history written in English. My evaluation now. This extract is fairly useful for understanding Nobunaga's early years and explains why he became a powerful and ruthless daimyo. The Story of Japan is a significant historical source because it was the first book in Japanese history written in English, meaning it is the closest account of Nobunaga's life we have that is written in English. So just a quick recap now of the wire structure. So for who, you need to say who made the source, what their expertise was on the topic that you're studying, and how well positioned they were to record the event. I for information, so when the source was made, what type of source is it, and the explicit information in the source as well. That's maybe the most important dot point out of all of these. Reliability, a statement on how reliable the source is and why, what biases exist in the source, what is the purpose of the source, and why did the creator make it. And then lastly, you need to evaluate the source. So what is the source useful for, and how useful is the source and why? So good luck with analysing and evaluating your historical sources at the year 7 and 8 level. And if you follow that structure, you should meet the skills outlined in the Australian syllabus. So good luck, guys, and thank you for watching.